In the middle of the Bavarian Alps, in southern Germany, a magical chateau rises among the clouds, Neuschwanstein Castle. With its white stone facade, multiple towers and turrets, and asymmetric architecture, it resembles a medieval fantasy castle. It even inspired Walt Disney.
All the fairy tales are combined in this castle.
Built at the end of the 19th century, it was the enchanting vision of its sole patron, King Ludwig II of Bavaria.
Neuschwanstein Castle is inseparable from King Ludwig II of Bavaria. It's rare that you can associate a castle with a single king.
Perched 200 meters high, the castle's construction presented a royal challenge.
One really has to wonder how men went about carrying enormous stones up there at that time, whether on horseback, donkeys, or carts.
But nothing could dash the king's ambitions. Dynamite leveled the peak. A steam crane towered over the immense construction site, and scaffolding rose more than 60 meters high.
Neuschwanstein Castle was one of the most complicated of its time.
Despite the abundance of financial, technical, and human resources, the construction, which started in 1868 and was supposed to last 3 years, took 24 years, because Ludwig II kept embellishing, enlarging, and changing the plans.
We possess more than 2,000 plans of Neuschwanstein Castle, drawings of all the rooms of the castle, detailed drawings, and numerous variations. This shows how intense the planning phase was.
The throne room went from a small chamber on the 3rd floor to the largest room of the castle on the 4th, so heavy that the floor had to be reinforced with steel beams.
Existing rooms had to be demolished and walls knocked down.
Despite its medieval appearance, Neuschwanstein is no drafty old castle. It featured ultra-modern comforts, electricity, running water, an intercom and telephone, and even central heating. Under construction techniques borrowed from theatrical sets, this room was transformed into a grotto made of plaster on steel.
At the time, there was even a waterfall inside this grotto and lights in various colors. The ceiling featured an artificial moon.
How did they manage to build the castle of Ludwig II in the middle of the mountains? How did it reflect the king's excess? Why were only 15 rooms finished out of the 200 planned? Through insights from the greatest experts on the castle and the Bavarian king, computer-generated reconstructions, and period archives, you are about to discover the amazing history of Neuschwanstein Castle, the most famous in all of Germany. Neuschwanstein Castle is located in Bavaria, southern Germany, in the heart of the Alps. It is the most visited castle in Germany and one of the busiest in Europe. With more than 1 million tourists a year who come to admire its unique appearance. Perched on a rocky promontory spanning only 800 square meters, detached from the rest of the mountain range, the castle seems to float in the sky.
When you look at Neuschwanstein, and particularly when you're standing below, it's a castle at the summit of a rocky peak. That's absolutely extravagant.
The tallest tower is 65 meters high, the equivalent of contemporary apartment buildings with more than 20 stories. Around it is about 20 towers and turrets of all heights and sizes. They're slightly narrowed at the top, so as to give the impression of being even more slender. One enters the castle through a large building, the gatehouse, which overlooks 2 courtyards connected by stairs. Around it, buildings provide access to the central part of the castle, the palace, where the living quarters are located. Next door are technical areas, including the Kemenate, or heated room. The building is comprised of a total of 200 rooms, with an area of nearly 6,000 square meters, but only about 15 of the rooms are furnished. It seems so familiar, it's also because its silhouette is part of the Disney Studios logo, which has been part of popular culture for over 70 years. At the end of the 1940s, legendary director Walt Disney was working on a new feature film called Cinderella. For the Prince's Castle, he looked for inspiration and found it in Neuschwanstein Castle.
He was looking for a picturesque palace and discovered Neuschwanstein Castle with all these towers, this great palace, and also the asymmetry created by the large entrance below. To him, it was the ultimate medieval castle.
But unlike authentic medieval castles, Neuschwanstein was far from being designed to defend a territory. Built in the late 19th century, it was in many ways in keeping with Walt Disney's sentiment, namely a fantasy medieval castle dreamed up by King Ludwig II, the last king of independent Bavaria. Gifted with a romantic temperament that exalted medieval myths, Ludwig II sprinkled his castle with a mix of different influences that were more or less phantasmagorical. The Singers' Hall is a Romanesque tribute to medieval chivalrous legends. The bedroom is decorated in Gothic style. The Throne Hall is of Byzantine inspiration. But there are also many more unexpected and romantic rooms, such as the grotto and its winter garden. The king's influence on the castle was exceptional.
Neuschwanstein Castle is inseparable from King Ludwig II of Bavaria. It's rare that a castle can be associated with a single king. The real architect of the castle, not in the technical sense, but in terms of artistic concept, was Ludwig II. Without him, Neuschwanstein Castle would never have existed.
Let's take a look back at the construction of an extraordinary castle. In 1866, Ludwig II had been king of Bavaria for 2 years when he decided to build a castle here in the heart of the Tyrol Mountains. Near the Pjolot Gorge on the Jugend, a 200-meter high peak where stood the ruins of 2 medieval castles.
These castles had been abandoned in the Middle Ages. They had fallen into disrepair and were overtaken by nature.
The landscape perfectly met the aspirations of the young king, who at the age of 20 admired the romantic German current and its grandiose scenery. It was also fashionable at the time to restore old castles.
The obsession with the Middle Ages, notably including the reconstruction of medieval castles, was completely in line with German culture in the 19th century.
The first idea was actually to rebuild the ruins of Vorderhohenschwangau, thus restoring the old castle. They immediately did surveys of these ruins.
Vorder- and Hinterhohenschwangau, the castles of Schwangau, probably date back to the 11th or 12th century. Vorderhohenschwangau was made up of a 30-meter long and 10-meter wide residential building with a courtyard and a tower. To the east, behind a 10-meter ditch, was the Hinterhohenschwangau, comprised mainly of a 13 by 13 meter square tower. The peak, where the ruins of these 2 castles were located, was well known to Ludwig II. It was 1 kilometer from Hohenschwangau Castle, where he had spent part of his childhood.
Ludwig II often walked in the area with his brother and mother.
It was a medieval castle that his father, Maximilian II, had rebuilt in the 1830s.
Schwangau Castle, now called Hohenschwangau, was built in the 12th century. It was the ancestral residence of the Counts of Schwangau. Maximilian II saw this castle and wanted to buy it. The area is very beautiful indeed. The owner at the time, a trader from the city of Fussen, asked for an exorbitant sum. Although he was very thrifty, Maximilian II agreed to pay it. He then had Hohenschwangau renovated by a theater decorator named Domenico Quaglio.
Von einem Bühnenbildner, nämlich Domenico Quaglio, sich dieses Hohenschwangau ausbauen.
These decorations, characteristic of the era, were like storybooks. Large paintings on the walls that told historical scenes or legends of the German Middle Ages. While inspired by his father's castle, Ludwig II decided to go even further.
Das Schloss Hohenschwangau.
To him, the Hohenschwangau castle was much too classic and much too simple.
Etwas zu bieder sozusagen, zu einfach.
Especially given that Ludwig II and his father had a tumultuous and contentious relationship. His new castle allowed him, in more ways than one, to surpass that of his father. From his chosen site, his new castle, which he first named Neuschwanstein, meaning the new Hohenschwangau, would overlook the castle of his childhood.
It was the castle of his roots. It was his father's castle that he had always hated. This was like saying, you build Hohenschwangau. Well, I'm going to do even better. I'm going to build the new Hohenschwangau, the Neuschwanstein, and it will surpass yours. It will be higher, more excessive, and more beautiful.
With that regard, Neuschwanstein clearly lived up to the aspirations of Ludwig II, as the castle ended up being at least 4 times bigger than Hohenschwangau. But filial rivalry wasn't the only reason for the expansion of what was supposed to be a simple reconstruction of ruins. There was also a geopolitical one. In 1866, the various German kingdoms, including Bavaria, were grouped into a German confederation dominated by Austria. Prussia challenged this domination and won the Unification War. Bavaria came under Prussian rule and was officially attached to its territory in 1870. Ludwig II then lost all political power.
Ludwig II became merely an executor of Prussian orders. He was no longer fully sovereign. It was a situation that he never accepted or came to terms with. The idea of building his own castles was actually a very concrete reaction to the humiliation he suffered politically.
That's probably when he thought, now is the time for me to do something really big.
Big, but also in an extremely short amount of time. Ludwig II wanted to finish his castle in only 3 years. His choice of location on this rocky peak made the construction site particularly difficult. As early as the summer of 1868, considerable human and technical resources were mobilized to meet this ambition.
All the court services immediately set to work, and a geologist was dispatched to examine and analyze this rocky peak and the ruins. The question was, can we really build a castle there? Is the rock massive and solid enough?
The first thing they did was demolish the ruins using a series of explosions.
But as this geologist was inspecting the ruins, the king already had a new idea. He decided he wanted an even bigger castle and asked if it was possible to enlarge the building surface.
And so, the explosions continued to level and lower the peak. Nearly 8 meters of rock were cleared to make way for the foundations. The surface eventually reached a length of more than 100 meters.
There is nothing really too unique in building a castle over another castle, but usually that's a case of adapting the previous castle design, or if it is ruins, you sort of use that outline. To an extent, there is either a reusing of foundations or a reusing of something from the previous castle to make things a little cheaper. Ludwig doesn't worry about this. but this is Ludwig II, this is his dream castle, he's going to build it.
The plateau was extended, but one problem remained: the large ravine that separated the ruins of the two castles. To fill this vast hole and accommodate the construction of the new castle, it was necessary to create solid foundations with brick walls up to 50 meters high.
To create a joint between the two original castle buildings and over a ravine, instead of building a bridge, he builds up a castle. And he's building it the whole way up to give it strength and to make it look like it's one continuous castle. So again, it adds to the image of the castle, this big, strong, solid image.
The only problem was the impossibility to design the castle as a single, perfect rectangle. When observed from the sky, the area is slightly curved. This angle was therefore integrated into the plans of the castle. The building would consist of two large rectangular parts connected by a trapeze-shaped area. The peak was ready, but supply challenges had to be taken into account.
Neuschwanstein was essentially a madness of a construction on a rocky outcrop atop a totally unique mountain. One really has to wonder how men went about carrying enormous stones up there at that time, whether on horseback, donkeys, or carts.
The nearest village was Füssen, more than 4 kilometers away. The only way to get to the peak was by hiking trails. Yet they had to get materials to the construction site, which was more than 200 meters up.
Neuschwanstein Castle was one of the most complicated construction sites of the era. You have to imagine bringing the materials to the Alps at this altitude was really complicated. The construction site and its organization were really something exceptional, a genuine prowess.
Again, many resources were put into place to meet this challenge. A road was built directly in the mountain using explosives. It was completed in June 1869, almost a year after the first detonations on the peak. Then, a gigantic wooden frame was built to create quick and direct access to the plateau. The building materials were brought to the bottom of the scaffolding, then raised over 200 meters by a steam crane, before being finally taken to the worksite.
They really used the most advanced techniques of the time to build this castle and materialize the dream of King Ludwig II. Had these modern techniques not been used, Neuschwanstein Castle would have most likely never been built.
But once you take away the crane, once you take away all the platform, it's going to make it impossible for people looking up to imagine how it was constructed. It's a pyramid trick in many ways. When we look at the Great Pyramids, they look impossible to have constructed in their time because they are done so precisely. But that's because all the things to build them have disappeared. It's a magic trick. And it's the same with Neuschwanstein.
Once the mountain was remodeled and the scaffolding created, an extraordinary construction site began on September 5, 1869, with the laying of the first stone of the castle. They had to move quickly to meet the 3-year deadline. Therefore, work on the site took place day and night. Sometimes more than 300 workers were present. Despite all of these efforts, instead of the 3 years hoped for, the project went on for 24 years. Beyond the difficulties inherent in such a construction site, the king's predominant role in the building process slowed things down considerably.
Normally, there would be an architect who was very much in vogue, who maybe won some public competitions or had done some small work for other rich nobles and other people who would then be commissioned, and they would draw up plans, and these plans would be reviewed, and then they would go backwards and forwards with the commissioner.
A first innovation in Neuschwanstein, architect Edward Riedel had to deal with a theater production designer, Christian Jank. The latter had worked on the staging of Wagner's operas, of which Ludwig II was a fervent admirer. A bit like a director does, the king guided the creative process. In that sense, the year 1867 was decisive. He first sent his teams of photographers and designers to Wartburg Castle. Originally built in the 11th century, this emblematic castle was undergoing a restoration that had begun in 1838 and would end in 1889. Its 12th century Romanesque palace was considered to be exceptionally well preserved. Both the buildings and the purely 19th century decoration that adorned the Singers' Hall and the function room were a major source of inspiration for Neuschwanstein. In July, while Ludwig II was visiting the Paris Exposition, Napoleon III invited him to see the Château de Pierrefonds. The renovation of this 14th century French medieval castle by legendary architect Eugène Viollet-le-Duc had been completed only 4 years earlier.
Ludwig II was fascinated by all these towers and turrets, by this picturesque side of the Château de Pierrefonds. He had a number of portfolios with architectural examples in his castle in Berg, where he resided, and which also fed his imagination.
The king gave his initial approval based on the drawings of his theater production designer, Christian Jank, which then guided the construction. But that's not all.
With Ludwig, he is almost staring over the shoulder of every architect he hires, going, not quite sure about that line. Oh, no, I don't like that. Oh, no, I'd like that a bit bigger, or that a bit thicker. And he is incredibly involved.
During the planning and even during construction, the king constantly asked for modifications, improvements, and upgrades. And when he didn't like something, they had to start all over again.
On June 11, 1872, 3 years after the first stone was laid, the main work on the first building was completed. It was the large gatehouse that included the huge entrance arch. When it became habitable, an apartment was set up on the top floor for Ludwig II. It was literally right next to the construction site.
From the window above the entrance gate, he could observe the construction site. The entrance gate was actually the first building to be completed. But he could also go out and contemplate the environment, the landscape, the mountains all around, as well as his castle that was taking shape. That's what he cared about.
In September 1872, work began on the main part of the castle, the palace. The efforts became even more extensive. In 1879 and 1880, at the peak of activity on the construction site, it is estimated that more than 465 tons of Salzburg marble, 600 tons of cement, 1,600 tons of sandstone, and nearly 500,000 or 1,750 tons of bricks were used.
At the other end of the site, another steam unit was present that was used to lift and move materials.
More than 2,000 cubic meters of wood were needed to build the scaffolding, which was over 60 meters high and made the site particularly dangerous. It is estimated that 30 to 40 people, mostly workers and artisans, died during the construction. In 1880, the general structure of Neuschwanstein was completed. In the palace, interior design and decoration work began. Ludwig II drew from all the influences he loved. Well-known medieval legends such as the myth of the Holy Grail and the Knights of the Round Table, but also those specific to the Bavarian region, such as the Swan Knight, and of course, Wagner's operas, for which he had unlimited passion. The courtyard of the castle was almost identical to the decor of a Wagner opera. The Singers' Hall featured medieval German tales rewritten by the composer. The staging was grandiose and meticulous. But while the production designer, Christian Jank, took inspiration from the medieval palace of the Wartburg Castle, historical credibility was far from being the first concern of the architects.
Seen from the outside, the castle resembled an old medieval knight's castle. But what nobody knew was that it was only so in appearance, because in reality, it was built of limestone bricks.
These are the same bricks that can be seen on the entrance building.
The court library in Munich used to have remarkable archives, some of the most remarkable in Europe, with visionary medieval manuscripts, including a number that came from Burgundy. And in these manuscripts, in the background, you can see whimsical castles, often white in color. These clearly inspired the exterior of Neuschwanstein Castle.
In the middle of construction, Ludwig II decided that he wanted white stone cladding, so the entire brick facade was covered with white limestone slabs. The barrel vaults in the castle have no architectural function. They're purely decorative. Moreover, he opted for large, modern windows with a steel frame.
Upon closer inspection, you can see that it's modern, that there's no lattice work on the windows, and that they're transparent.
Neither the nobility of the materials nor the building means and techniques mattered.
Ludwig II didn't attach much importance to the details of construction. To him, what was important was to produce a theatrical effect.
The king didn't ask, how did you do it? Did you use iron beams? What are the consequences? Instead, he asked, is it feasible? Can it be done quickly?
If materials such as iron hadn't been used, and the engineers hadn't accomplished all these feats, Neuschwanstein would not exist.
While Ludwig II approved of the modern technical solutions that allowed him to realize his vision, he also wanted his castle to have the most advanced comfort possible.
Ludwig II really did go shopping for everything. He wanted everything in there. When you're talking about the construction techniques, he's using the latest steel technology as well as the thickest walls you can possibly imagine for the time. But also, he's not just stopping with that level of technology. This is going to be a castle, yes, but it's going to be a castle. It's going to have telephones. It's going to have everything he can possibly imagine put in there.
These state-of-the-art installations did not present any invention or innovation. However, they were all there. Each floor of the palace and the royal apartments had running water and electricity. The toilets had automatic flush systems. The third and fourth floors were equipped with telephone connections. There was even an electric intercom system used by the king to call his servants. Meals were not carried by stairs, but by an elevator. The royal apartments were heated with a hot air system, the ancestor of central heating. There was a room that served as a boiler to heat the air, which then went up the floors through ducts.
It was a system of hot air that was fed from the cellar and prevented the odor of a stove in the rooms, or soot, or dirt. It was an added comfort.
Next to the boiler was another room dedicated to heating water, originally planned as a future bathroom, but repurposed. It provided hot water to the kitchen, which featured all the technical innovations of the time, including built-in ovens with a device to heat plates and a hood system. Of course, this abundance was not without consequence. The construction site was extremely expensive. Ludwig II financed it mainly from his personal funds, but he had to quickly take out loans, especially as he launched other construction projects at the same time. Neuschwanstein's initial funding amounted to just over 3 million marks. Ultimately, the construction doubled in cost to more than 6 million marks, the equivalent of 40 million euros today. In 1886, the king's total debt was colossal, nearly 14 million marks. When his creditors warned him that they were going to seize his castles, Ludwig II threatened to commit suicide. Relations between the king and the Bavarian government deteriorated, especially since the king also largely financed Wagner's work, which was poorly perceived by the population.
Die Entwicklung ist, dass sich immer mehr
He increasingly distanced himself from his people.
hat und die
So-called representation missions, which a king normally performs, such as attending parties and hosting receptions,
zeigt.
were fewer and fewer in number,
Das hat
and stopped completely in the last year of his life.
im letzten Jahr seines Lebens dann ganz eingestellt.
Neuschwanstein's interiors reflected Ludwig II's need for solitude. Over the years, reception rooms were abandoned or simply never furnished. The castle could never have accommodated the entire royal court. Only Ludwig II and his servants. The plan of the third floor, designed by first architect Edward Riedel at the end of 1868, initially incorporated, in addition to the apartments of the king, the traditional rooms of a castle of that time: a library, a reception hall, and guest rooms. A decade later, these rooms disappeared from the plans. In 1884, Ludwig II settled into the palace. He appointed Julius Hofmann as principal architect, the third since construction had begun in 1869. In similar fashion, the plans were in constant evolution.
We have in our archives more than 2,000 plans of Neuschwanstein, blueprints of all the rooms of the castle, detailed plans, and also many variants. This shows how intense the planning phase was. Some ideas were accepted, others were rejected.
But the biggest change concerned the palace's masterpiece, the throne hall. This room was the perfect testament to the ambition of Ludwig II, which knew no boundaries and was ever fluid, because originally it was fated to look very different.
Initially, the throne hall was supposed to be relatively small, but in 1878, Ludwig II wanted a much larger part of the main building to be converted into a throne hall. The chief architect replied by mail, almost a little desperately, saying, "Yes, it's possible, but all the ducts and window frames have already been installed, so we have to redo everything."
Initially a small room on the third floor, it gradually replaced the reception halls of the royal apartments.
Ludwig II hat diesen Saal nicht von Anfang an vorgesehen.
Ludwig II hadn't planned to build such a room from the start. Over time, the idea came to him to show his importance and also that he was the king. There was a starry dome, a chandelier that resembled the crown of a Byzantine ruler, and a mosaic with animals and plants on the floor. In other words, the sovereign, the king, the crown, was connected to heaven and God by the chandelier on one hand and to the earth on the other.
To live up to these expectations and fulfill its function, the room had to be impressive. So, a few years later, Ludwig II decided to establish his throne room over 2 floors.
As a result, existing rooms had to be demolished and walls knocked down.
Between the 3rd and 4th floors, it measured 13 meters high and covered 240 square meters. As if the disproportionate size of the room wasn't enough, Ludwig II complicated things by wanting to adorn it with a gigantic vault. Had the usual construction techniques of the era been used, the weight of a stone structure would have been too great and everything would have fallen apart. To lighten the structure, the stone was replaced by a material that was rarely used in construction: steel.
The design of this throne room required careful thought about what could be made lighter and what materials could be used and where. The throne room in Neuschwanstein Castle was made of various materials. It was precisely this mix that made the difference. Weight was reduced wherever possible.
Even the columns used to support the rows of arches that surrounded the entire throne hall were designed to weigh as little as possible.
Wenn wir als Besucher in den Thronsaal hineingehen würden,
If visitors of this throne room had X-ray vision, they would be surprised, because the columns, both on the bottom and the top, are hollow.
in sich ein Gusseisenkern.
They're cast iron tubes covered with scagliola, which is imitation marble.
Die mit Kunstmarmor, mit Stuckmarmor, mit
As
Metallfolie
such,
ummantelt sind.
the weight was reduced.
Das hat Gewicht
If they had been real marble or stone columns, they would have weighed a lot more.
Säulen gewesen wären, hätten die deutlich mehr Gewicht gehabt.
The builders also had to come up with solutions for the impressive dome, which was ultimately designed like a theater set.
Es waren erst auch zwei
2 domes were also planned, which in the end were transformed into one large dome made of wire and iron trellis. This architectural element obviously had an impact on the upper and lower floors.
So much so that the room below had to be reinforced as well. A system in frequent use today was implemented for the first time in Neuschwanstein: H-shaped steel beams.
And these were new technique of steel beams at the time, but they used them even bigger and thicker than they needed to be. So they don't actually need to be as big or as thick as he makes them for the space of the throne room, but still, it allows the throne room to be far larger and far more solidly constructed than it would perhaps otherwise.
The throne room was the jewel of Neuschwanstein. But of the 15 rooms completed, there was a particularly unusual one: the grotto and its winter garden.
Neuschwanstein Castle has plenty of surprises. It's wonderful to stroll through this castle and be surprised. When you're in the living room, for example, and then you go into a small room that looks like a cave, it's very astonishing.
Verwundert.
In the middle of the royal apartments, between the king's living room and office, Ludwig II decided to create a cave inspired by the grotto of Venus in Wagner's opera named Tannhäuser. The grotto was an imitation of a cave covered with stalactites, embellished with colorful electric lighting, a very modern mechanism for the time.
Back then, there was even a waterfall inside the grotto. When you heard the water gurgling, you were immediately immersed in a completely different world. There was even an artificial moon on the ceiling.
And yet, in the initial blueprints, this cave didn't exist.
At first, Ludwig II said, "I want a big grotto in Neuschwanstein." But there wasn't enough room. Even though the plans were designed as such, Ludwig II declared he wanted a grotto next to his office, even if just a small one. Once again, the king's wishes and orders took precedence over everything else. If he said, "I want a cave, not a library," it had to be done.
The grotto was created by theater set designers. Apart from the drawings of the basic concept, the rest of the room was built on site, without plans. The whole structure was made of a type of steel mesh, in which fabric mesh was interspersed. Plaster was cast on top of that to give an impression of stones and rocks.
When you think of a cave, you imagine something dark. But Ludwig II brought in light through a large glass door, which he had decorated with a swan. It was a sliding door that allowed him direct access to his small winter garden.
In this garden were tropical trees and a fountain, and above all, an impressive view of the outdoor landscape. This panorama was provided by 3-meter glass panels, an exceptional size for the time.
This is evidence that for Ludwig II, it was very important to have an outward view and also to establish a link with nature.
Grottos are actually quite common in sort of castles time. They're something which quite a lot of people have. But the thing is, the quality of the grotto, which Ludwig has mentioned, the beauty of its internal, the great imagery it's going to inspire, and the winter garden, and the combining these things all. He's combining everything to try and build the perfect space. It's rare you have all these things and you have all this design in the structure. The whole thing is a fairy tale castle.
While many stages of construction remained, the king died on June 13, 1886. Ludwig II never saw his castle completed. In 1886, inside the palace, and in addition to the throne room, the main rooms on the 4th floor included the forecourt and the huge singers' hall. The 3rd floor held the dining room, bedroom, and chapel. These were the only ones decorated in Gothic style. The king's bedroom boasted a huge carved wooden bed. 14 carpenters worked more than 4 years on the figures of the 4-poster bed and the oak woodwork. In addition, there were a dressing room, a living room that opened onto the cave, a study, and the officer's room. The 2nd floor was barely furnished. The guest rooms were never started. Nor was the Moorish Hall, a purely decorative room desired by the king and planned below the throne hall. The 1st floor only held rooms reserved for servants. On the ground floor, the knights' baths were never built either. In 1887, the mosaic that decorated the floor of the throne room was laid. But the room was left without its central element, the throne, a powerful symbol of the tragic end of Ludwig II.
And what's one of the most saddening things in a way is after he dies, they complete the things to an extent, but they don't complete the full details. They don't complete all the buildings he's planned. They do not complete the throne room with the throne.
Ludwig II imagined several parts of the castle for which construction did not begin before his death. The most important was a keep with a chapel. Today, from the outside, no one would suspect that Neuschwanstein should have had an additional tower. And yet, Ludwig II had planned to install a giant 90-meter tall keep right in the middle of the courtyard, next to a small adjacent chapel. Only the foundations remain. On the floor of the upper courtyard, one can still see the slabs that delineate the location of the missing keep.
If a keep were located there, you wouldn't have the magnificent view that you have when you're in the lower courtyard looking towards the main building. The tourists who come here want to enjoy that view. The keep would have completely blocked it, and the upper courtyard would have been much smaller.
But to Ludwig II, this would have meant another room to decorate. To the west of the palace, a large garden with terraces and a fountain were also planned. But the Bavarian government refused to finance these visions of grandeur. Their aim was to finish the work that had been started. The Knight's House was built and simplified without the tree trunk-shaped columns imagined by Ludwig II. Only the foundations of the main room still exist. In 1892, the square tower was completed, as was the Kemenate, but in simplified form and without the sculptures of the saints envisioned by the late king. 1892 marked the final stop to the construction of the castle.
The laying of the first stone took place in September 1869. It wasn't until 1892 that the exterior walls of the Kemenate, the heated room, were completed. That's where the administrative office is today. These walls were built after the king's death to make Neuschwanstein exterior even more pleasant.
The construction of the castle, which was originally supposed to last only 3 years, was completed 24 years later.
He's imagining their permanent stamp they leave on the world thanks to their castles. So the odds are, no matter when he died, he was always going to leave at least one castle unfinished. The question was which castle it would be that would be left unfinished. And it's Neuschwanstein that is left.
Die Burg Neuschwanstein.
Had the king lived longer, Neuschwanstein Castle would certainly not look the same today. But you can't say that it would be exactly like the plans we have in our archives, because Ludwig II would have asked for a whole bunch of modifications during construction. But what's amazing is that Neuschwanstein Castle, even if it isn't finished, is considered throughout the world as the ultimate medieval castle, despite the fact that its keep annex and other parts are missing. Yet everything that was achieved and desired by the king is so perfect that it immediately reminds you of a medieval castle. And that's fascinating.
Just before leaving Neuschwanstein for the last time, Ludwig II made his servant promise to never open the doors to anyone. Yet only 7 weeks after his death, the castle was open to visitors.
There was a desire to open quickly so soon after his death to attract crowds. The price of admission was very high. Visiting the castle of Ludwig II cost 3 marks.
This money allowed the Bavarian government to quickly clear the debt attached to the castle, which immediately became a major tourist attraction in Germany and the world. The history of the castle and its construction were intimately linked to Ludwig II, more than any castle of the time. It was Ludwig II himself who made Neuschwanstein such a unique and astounding castle.
The ideas, fantasies, and desires of Ludwig II are embodied in this castle. They're an integral part of the building and allow us to discover many things about the person he was, notably his vision, his aspirations, and thought process.
His visual creativity was pioneering and innovative.
He knew precisely what he wanted, much like the director of a film shooting a scene that needs to correspond exactly to what they envision.
At the cost of a perfectionism that required the constant reshaping of plans and instructions to the project managers.
No regular architect would have accepted to be treated this way. You have to do it like this. No, that's not good. Do it again, do it again, do it again. Of course, a normal construction always allows for modifications, but that doesn't mean you know what's on other people's minds. This particular build was never open to compromise.
No compromise on aesthetic ambitions or comfort. The castle was equipped with state-of-the-art devices, telephones, running water, electricity, and even an electric intercom and central heating system. Perched on a 200-meter-high peak, the construction site required the deployment of considerable resources in money, men, and materials. The result was the creation of a fantasy medieval castle, which rests as much on representations as it does on symbols, but not on materials or medieval construction methods. On the contrary, the most modern and astonishing techniques were implemented.
What's amazing is that Neuschwanstein Castle, even though it was never finished, is considered worldwide as the ultimate example of a medieval castle.
Because all the fairy tales are combined in this castle.
That is how Neuschwanstein Castle, built in the 19th century, became in our imagination the most beautiful example of a castle of the Middle Ages.